Wyoming Territory, 1885. The dust of redemption was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the vast, thirsty land that surrounded the town. It coated the unpainted planks of the boardwalks, muted the lettering on the general store, and clung to the brim of Sheriff Elias Thorne's hat. He stood on the porch of his office, a solitary figure carved from the same hard granite as the distant mountains, and watched the heat shimmer rise from the single dirt road that served as the town's artery. The silence was his oldest companion, a heavy blanket stitched with the drone of a lazy fly and the occasional, distant cry of a hawk. Elias had cultivated this solitude. He had built his life around it, a fortress with walls of quiet routine and emotional distance. Each day was a copy of the last. The early morning ride to check the territory's edges, the noon meal taken alone at his desk, the slow afternoon spent watching the town breathe its shallow breaths, and the evening spent in the company of a book and a single lantern. Attachments he had learned in the cruelest way possible were vulnerabilities. They were cracks in the armor a man needed to survive out here, entry points for a grief so profound it could hollow a man out from the inside, leaving nothing but a shell. He had been hollowed out once. He would not allow it to happen again. His past was a ghost that walked beside him, visible only in the hard set of his jaw and the deep-seated weariness in his gray eyes. He had come west to escape it, to put a continent between himself and the two small graves on a windswept hill in Ohio, Mary and little Samuel. The fever had taken them in less than a week, leaving behind a silence in his small house that was louder than any scream. So he had run, trading the green hills of his home for this unforgiving expanse of rock and sage, believing its harshness could scour the memories from his soul. It had not worked, but it had taught him a different kind of survival. Here, a man relied on his own hands, his own aim, and his own judgment. There was a clean, brutal honesty to it that he had come to depend on. A sound, thin and sharp as a needle, pierced the afternoon quiet. It was the whistle of the eastbound train, still miles away, but carried on the dry air like a prophecy. It was the only thing that regularly broke the town's placid rhythm, a twice-weekly intrusion from the world he had left behind. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his gut. The train brought mail, supplies, and occasionally trouble. It brought strangers with their complicated lives and their hopeful or desperate eyes, disrupting the careful, empty peace he had constructed. He shifted his weight, the worn leather of his gun belt creaking in protest. His hand rested on the smooth wooden grip of his Colt, a habit as unconscious as breathing. He was the law in redemption, and the law meant order. The train, for all its necessity, always felt like a harbinger of chaos. He watched the plume of smoke grow on the horizon, a dark smudge against the brilliant, cloudless blue. The sound grew with it, a chuffing, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. The town began to stir. Mr. Henderson emerged from the general store to sweep the dust from his section of the boardwalk. Martha, the stout, no-nonsense widow who kept his house in order, appeared on the porch of the boarding house, shaking out a rag with unnecessary vigor. A few cowhands ambled out of the saloon, squinting toward the tracks. The arrival of the train was an event, a brief chapter in the town's slow-moving story. For Elias, it was simply a duty. He had to be there, to meet it, to see who and what it deposited onto his patch of dirt. He stepped off the porch, his boots making soft thuds in the thick dust. The sun was a physical weight on his shoulders. He walked the short distance to the small, sun-bleached depot, his shadow long and stark behind him. Ben, the station master, was already out on the platform, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He nodded to Elias, his face wrinkled with the permanent squint of a man who spent his life staring into the sun. "Right on time, Sheriff," he called out, his voice raspy. Elias just touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, his gaze fixed on the approaching engine. It was a black iron beast, breathing smoke and steam, slowing its inexorable approach with a screech of metal on metal that set his teeth on edge. It was a sound of progress, of connection, of the very world he had tried so hard to sever himself from. The train hissed to a stop, the sudden silence afterward feeling profound. A few passengers disembarked, a pair of dusty prospectors, a salesman in a rumpled suit, a family with 3 small children who immediately began to chase each other around the platform. Elias scanned them with a practiced, dispassionate eye. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, another figure appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, silhouetted against the dim interior. For a moment, she just stood there, a hesitation that seemed out of place in this world of decisive, necessary movements. When she stepped down onto the platform, it was as if a different kind of light had arrived with her. She was from the East. It was plain in every line of her being. Her dress was a deep forest green, finely made, but now wilted and creased from travel. A small, elegant hat was pinned to a cascade of honey blonde hair that had partially escaped its neat arrangement. In her gloved hands, she clutched a leather reticule, as if it were a lifeline. She looked tired and lost and utterly, profoundly out of place. Her eyes, the color of summer sky, just before dusk, swept over the dusty street, the raw wooden buildings, and the hard-faced people, and Elias saw a flicker of dismay, quickly masked by a determined lift of her chin. He saw her scan the small crowd, her gaze passing over him once, dismissing him as just another piece of the rough landscape, before continuing her search. A frown line appeared between her brows. The person she was expecting was not there. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome pang of something he refused to name. It was not pity. It was a weary resignation. Trouble, just as he'd expected. He remained where he was, leaning against a support post, a detached observer. It was not his place to interfere unless asked. He watched as the train gave a final, great sigh of steam and began to pull away, its whistle a mournful farewell. The woman's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly as the last car receded into the distance, leaving her truly alone on the platform. She took a hesitant step forward, her fine leather shoes ill-suited for the splintered planks of the depot. She seemed to gather herself, a small, brave soldier preparing to face an unknown enemy. She approached Ben, who was busy supervising the unloading of a few crates. Elias was too far away to hear her words, but he could read the exchange in their posture. He heard the gentle, articulate cadence of her voice and saw Ben's apologetic shrug. The station master pointed a thumb down the main street, gave another shrug, and turned back to his work, leaving her standing there, a solitary island of green silk in a sea of brown dust. She turned, her gaze once again sweeping the town, this time with a more desperate edge. Her eyes met his. For a long moment, she held his gaze, and he saw the fear and uncertainty warring with a fierce, innate pride. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, the barest acknowledgement of her existence. He was the sheriff. If she needed help, she would have to ask for it. He would not offer it unsolicited. That was not his way. He saw her take a deep breath, her shoulders squaring. She picked up her single, heavy-looking valise and took a determined step off the platform. Her heel caught on an uneven board. It happened in an instant. A small gasp, a lurching loss of balance, the valise tumbling from her grasp. Elias moved without thinking. The years of solitude had not dulled his reflexes. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his arms reaching out to catch her before she could fall. She stumbled directly into him, her hands flying up to brace against his chest. The impact was a shock to his system. He was suddenly, overwhelmingly aware of her. She was lighter than he expected, yet solid and real in his arms. Through the rough fabric of his shirt, he could feel the frantic beat of her heart, a trapped bird against his ribs. A faint scent of lavender and something else, something clean and womanly, rose from her hair, an aroma so foreign in his world of leather, dust, and pine that it momentarily disoriented him. Her face was tilted up to his, her eyes wide with surprise and alarm. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, the soft curve of her lips, parted in a silent, oh, the world seemed to shrink to the small space they occupied, the sounds of the town fading to a dull hum. For the first time in 5 years, a woman was in his arms, and the forgotten feeling of it, the simple, devastating warmth of it, sent a tremor through him that he was certain she must have felt. He steadied her, his hands firm on her upper arms. "Careful, ma'am," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He immediately released her and stepped back, creating a careful distance between them. The air rushed into the space, cold and empty. He bent to retrieve her valise, the movement a welcome excuse to break the intensity of her gaze. He straightened, holding the bag, and saw that a flush had risen on her cheeks. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice a little breathless. She had seen the star on his vest. "I am not as graceful as I once was. It seems the boardwalks are uneven," he stated, a simple fact that required no emotional response. "You were looking for someone?" She drew herself up, her composure returning like a shield. "I was. A Mr. Jonathan Croft. He was to meet me. We have been corresponding." There was a delicate hesitation on the last word that told him everything he needed to know. "A mail-order bride, or something close to it." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew of no Jonathan Croft in Redemption. He knew a Silas Croft, the ruthless cattle baron whose ranch sprawled over half the territory, a man who collected land and power with the same greedy appetite a locust had for a green field. "There's no Jonathan Croft here," Elias said, his tone flat. "There's Silas Croft. His ranch is north of town." Her face paled. The carefully constructed mask of composure began to crumble. "Silas? No, his name was Jonathan. He wrote of a small farm, of starting a life here. He sent this." She fumbled with the clasp on her reticule, her gloved fingers shaking slightly. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small, tintype photograph. She held out to him. Elias took it. The photograph was of a handsome, smiling young man, someone Elias had never seen before in his life. The letter described a life that did not exist in this harsh place, full of poetic nonsense about blooming roses and gentle streams. It was a fantasy written to lure a hopeful woman west. "This man is not from Redemption," Elias said, handing the items back to her. "And the only roses that grow here have thorns an inch long." He saw the last of her hope drain from her face, leaving behind a stark, terrifying vulnerability. She was alone, thousands of miles from home, lured here by a lie. "What is your name, ma'am?" "Clara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Clara Pemberton," he nodded. "Miss Pemberton, it seems you've been deceived." The words were brutal, but there was no sense in softening them. The West did not deal in soft truths. "You should take a room at the boarding house. The next train east is in 3 days. You should be on it." He was already pushing her away, putting her problem into a neat box with a simple solution. "Go home. Go back where you belong. Do not bring your complications into my world." Her chin came up, and a spark of defiance lit her eyes, chasing away some of the fear. "I cannot. I sold everything I had to make this journey. There is no home to return to." Her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of utter finality. She was not just stranded, she was shipwrecked. Elias felt the walls of his fortress begin to crack. He was the sheriff. It was his duty to protect the people in his town, even the temporary ones. He could not leave her standing in the dust, a lamb waiting for the wolves. Silas Croft was most certainly a wolf, and Elias had a grim suspicion about why he, or someone in his employ, would go to such lengths to bring a woman like Clara Pemberton to redemption. It smelled of deceit and greed. He let out a slow breath, the air rasping in his throat. "All right," he said, the word is surrender. "My housekeeper, Martha, runs the boarding house, but it's full up with railroad surveyors. You can take the spare room at my house. For now, until we sort this out." The offer felt like a betrayal of his own hard-won peace. He was inviting the world, with all its messy complications, right across his threshold. Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and desperate relief. "Your house, Sheriff? I couldn't possibly impose." "Martha will be there," he said quickly, as much for his own benefit as for hers. "It's proper. It's the sheriff's residence, next to the jail. It's the safest place in town." He didn't wait for her to argue. He picked up her valise, the weight of it a tangible symbol of the burden he had just assumed. "This way, Miss Pemberton." He turned and walked back toward his office, not looking to see if she was following. He knew she would. She had no other choice. And as he walked, he could feel her presence behind him, a small, determined shadow in his solitary world, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same. The sheriff's house was attached to the office and jail, a practical, unadorned structure built of the same weathered pine as everything else in Redemption. Inside, however, Martha's influence was immediately apparent. It was impeccably clean, and the air smelled of dried lavender and beeswax. A simple rag rug lay on the polished floorboards, and handmade quilts were draped over the 2 armchairs that faced a cold stone hearth. It was a space of quiet order, a reflection of the life Elias had tried to build. Bringing Clara into it felt like introducing a vibrant, unpredictable wildflower into a carefully tended, monochromatic garden. Martha met them at the door, her hands on her hips, her expression stern until she saw the exhaustion and fear in Clara's face. Martha's gaze softened. She looked from Clara to Elias, a question in her eyes. "Boarding house is full, Martha," Elias stated, setting the valise down. "Miss Pemberton will be staying in the spare room." He delivered the information like a field report, devoid of emotion. Martha simply nodded, her shrewd eyes taking in every detail of the situation. "Of course," she said, her voice warm and reassuring as she turned to Clara. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed, dear. Come with me. We'll get you settled." She gently took Clara's arm, leading her down a short hallway and effectively dismissing Elias. He was grateful for it. He stood for a moment in the sudden quiet of the main room, listening to the murmur of their voices. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He retreated to his office, the adjoining room, and shut the door, seeking the familiar comfort of its Spartan interior. But the scent of lavender seemed to have followed him, a subtle, lingering ghost. Later that evening, the 3 of them sat at the small kitchen table for supper. The meal was a quiet affair, punctuated by the clinking of forks against stoneware plates. Martha kept up a gentle stream of chatter, talking about the dry weather and the exorbitant price of flour, a verbal cushion against the thick silence that stretched between Elias and Clara. Elias ate methodically, his gaze fixed on his plate. He was acutely aware of the woman sitting across from him. He noticed the way she held her fork, with a delicate grace that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn kitchen. He noticed the weariness that shadowed her eyes, but also the stubborn set of her jaw. She was not as fragile as she looked. "Sheriff Thorne," she said suddenly, her voice clear and direct, cutting through Martha's monologue about a neighbor's chickens. He looked up, surprised she had addressed him. "This man, Silas Croft. You know of him. What kind of man is he?" Elias chose his words carefully. "He's a man who believes this territory belongs to him. He came here with money and bought up all the good land with a decent water supply. Or he ran off the people who wouldn't sell, and the law," she asked, a challenge in her tone. "What does the law do about such a man?" "The law requires proof, Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice flat. "Fear and rumor aren't proof. Croft is careful. He keeps his hands clean. He hires others to do his dirty work." Her hands were clenched in her lap. "So he is a villain from a penny dreadful. A land baron who cheats and bullies his way to power. That's a fair assessment," Elias conceded. He saw the fire in her eyes and felt a grudging respect. She was not just a victim. She was a fighter. She was trying to understand the rules of this new, dangerous game she had been unwillingly drawn into. After a moment, he added, "Do you have family, Miss Pemberton? Anyone who might send for you?" Her gaze dropped to her plate. The fire went out, replaced by a deep, profound sadness. "No," she said softly. "My parents passed last winter. I was a governess in Boston. The family I worked for moved to England. My position was terminated. The letters from Jonathan seemed like a sign. A chance for a new life." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It seems I was a fool. You were hopeful," Elias corrected her, the words surprising him as much as they did her. "That's not the same thing," For a fleeting moment, their eyes met across the table, and he saw a flicker of gratitude. It made him deeply uncomfortable. He pushed his chair back and stood up abruptly. "I have paperwork to attend to." He retreated to his office without another word, leaving the two women alone in the warm kitchen light. He could not afford to feel sympathy. Sympathy was a weakness, a chink in the armor. He sat at his desk, the official reports in front of him blurring into meaningless squiggles. He could not concentrate. He could hear the low murmur of their voices from the kitchen, Clara's refined tones and Martha's earthy ones. He was an outsider listening in on a world of quiet connection he had long since abandoned. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble a familiar, grounding sensation. What had he done? He had brought a storm into the calm harbor of his life. A beautiful, vulnerable, and dangerously compelling storm. Later, when the house was quiet, he knew he should go to bed. But he was restless. He walked back into the main room. The fire in the hearth had been lit, casting a warm, dancing glow over the simple furniture. Clara was sitting in one of the armchairs, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, though the night was not cold. She was staring into the flames, her profile etched by the firelight. She looked smaller now, her earlier defiance worn away by exhaustion and despair. He stood in the shadows, intending to walk past her to his own room, but she spoke without turning. "I don't think I can sleep." Her voice was soft, laced with weariness. He found himself walking toward the hearth, drawn by an invisible current. He took the other armchair, leaving a careful distance between them. For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the flames consume the dry pine logs. The only sound were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. It was a comfortable silence, not a strained one, and that in itself was unsettling. "Why did you come here, Sheriff?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "To this place? It feels like the end of the world. That was the idea," he answered, his voice low. He did not know why he was talking to her, why he was not simply getting up and walking away. Perhaps it was the firelight, or the lateness of the hour, or the raw honesty of her own vulnerability that seemed to demand some of his own. "Were you running from something?" she pressed gently. He stared into the heart of the fire, at the glowing, crumbling embers. The images rose in his mind, as sharp and clear as the day they happened. Mary, her face pale with fever, her hand limp in his. Samuel, his small chest struggling for breath. The silence of the house after. "From someone," he corrected her, his voice thick with a pain he thought he had buried. "My wife and my son, they died. Of fever, back in Ohio." He had not spoken those words aloud in 5 years. They felt like stones in his mouth, heavy and sharp-edged. Saying them did not lessen their weight, but it changed it somehow, releasing a pressure he hadn't even been aware he was carrying. He felt her gaze on him now, but he could not bring himself to meet it. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and her voice was filled with a genuine compassion that cut through his defenses. It was not pity, it was understanding. "I lost my parents in the influenza epidemic. I know what it is to be left with the silence," and there it was, a bridge of shared loss, built in the flickering firelight. He finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were filled with tears, not for herself, but for him. In her face, he saw his own grief reflected, and for the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone in it. He saw the strength that had carried her through her own sorrow, the resilience that had brought her all the way across the country in search of a new life. He was beginning to understand that Clara Pemberton was not a complication to be managed. She was a survivor just like him. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice softer than before. He stood up, the spell broken. "Things will look clearer in the morning." It was a lie. He knew things were about to get much more complicated. But as he walked to his room, he felt a subtle shift inside him, a thawing around the edges of the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, not by force, but by a quiet woman with sad eyes and a courageous spirit who understood the language of silence. The next morning, a fragile truce of domesticity settled over the small house. Elias rose before dawn, as was his habit, but when he entered the kitchen, he found Clara already there, a simple apron tied over her dress. She was standing by the stove, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. She looked more rested, the shadows beneath her eyes less pronounced. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted with a small smile. "The silence out here, it's so loud. In Boston, there was always the sound of carriages, of voices. Here, I can hear the blood in my own ears. You get used to it," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the counter, the warm ceramic a comfort in his hands. He watched her as she gazed out the window. "What will you do, Miss Pemberton?" She turned from the window, her expression resolute. "I will find work. Martha mentioned that Mr. Henderson at the general store might need assistance with his ledgers. My penmanship is excellent, and I am quick with figures. I will not be a burden to you." Sheriff, her pride was a tangible thing, a shield she wielded with expert care. "It's no burden," he found himself saying, "but you need to be careful. If Silas Croft was behind this scheme to get you here, he won't be happy that you've slipped from his grasp." "Why?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What could he possibly want with me? A penniless governess?" "I don't know yet," Elias admitted. "But a man like Croft doesn't do anything without a reason, and his reasons are always rooted in greed." "Did this Jonathan mention anything specific in his letters? Any property? Any family names?" Clara thought for a moment, her gaze distant. "He mentioned my father. He said he had known him years ago. He spoke of my father's one failed venture, a piece of land he bought out west, sight unseen, as an investment. Father always called it his great folly. He lost the deed for years, only found it again shortly before he passed. It was all he had left to leave me." A cold understanding dawned on Elias. "This land, do you know where it is?" "Somewhere in this territory," she said, shrugging. "The deed is in my valise. It's just a worthless piece of paper, according to my father. He said the land was arid, useless. Nothing in this territory is useless if it has water," Elias said, his voice grim. "And Croft has been trying to control all the water in this valley for years." "Let me see the deed." She retrieved it from her room, a brittle, folded document tied with a faded ribbon. Elias spread it carefully on the kitchen table. The legal description was dense, but the survey map was clear enough. He recognized the landmarks. The plot of land, a mere 160 acres, was small, but it sat directly astride Willow Creek, the only year-round water source for miles. And it was situated squarely between Croft's main ranch and the vast grazing lands to the north he was trying to acquire. Without that land, and the water that ran through it, Croft's ambitions were crippled. "This isn't a folly, Miss Pemberton," Elias said, his voice low and serious. "This is a kingdom." He looked up at her, and she saw the gravity in his eyes. "Croft didn't lure you here for marriage. He lured you here for this deed. He likely planned to marry you, gain control of your property, and then ensure you were no longer a problem." The color drained from Clara's face as the true, monstrous nature of the deception became clear. She sank into a chair, her hand going her throat. He would have killed me, it was not a question. He would have," Elias confirmed, his voice hard as iron. "And now that his plan has gone wrong, he'll want this deed. And he'll do anything to get it." He folded the document and handed it back to her. "You are in more danger than I thought." That afternoon, the threat moved from a grim possibility to a physical reality. As Clara walked with Martha toward the general store, two men stepped out of the saloon, blocking their path. They were rough-looking, their faces unshaven, their eyes cold and flat. Elias had seen them before, riding with Croft's foreman. "Well now, what have we here?" One of them sneered, his gaze crawling over Clara in a way that made her skin prickle. "You must be the pretty little thing our boss is so interested in." Martha, who had faced down blizzards and bandits in her time, was not easily intimidated. "Get out of our way, Jed," she snapped. "You have no business with this lady." The man named Jed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, I think we do. Mr. Croft just wants to welcome the newcomer. He asked us to escort her out to the ranch for a little chat." He reached out to grab Clara's arm. Clara flinched back, her heart hammering against her ribs. But before Jed's fingers could touch her, a hand shot out and clamped around his wrist like a steel trap. It was Elias. He had been watching from his office window, a premonition coiling in his gut. He had moved so silently they hadn't even heard him approach. She declined the invitation, Elias said, his voice quiet, but carrying a deadly chill that was more menacing than any shout. He squeezed, and Jed gasped as pain shot up his arm. The second man went for his gun, but he wasn't fast enough. Elias released Jed with a shove that sent him stumbling back, and in the same fluid motion, drew his own Colt. The click of the hammer being cocked was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the street. "I wouldn't," Elias advised, the barrel of his pistol aimed squarely at the man's chest. The man froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his gun. Fear and hatred warred in his eyes. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The dust motes danced in the sunlight between them. Finally, the second man slowly raised his hands in surrender. "Now get out of my town," Elias ordered, his voice still low and even. "And tell Croft that Miss Pemberton is under my protection. If you or any of his other dogs come near her again, I will put you down." Jed rubbed his wrist, his face a mask of fury. "You'll regret this, Thorne." "Croft gets what he wants, not this time," Elias said. He stood his ground, a granite statue of implacable law, until the two men backed away, mounted their horses, and rode out of town, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. Elias holstered his weapon, the tension draining from him, leaving a cold calm in its wake. He turned to Clara. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Admiration, perhaps. Gratitude. It made him uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gruff to cover the surge of protectiveness he had felt. She nodded, unable to speak. Martha, however, found her voice. "That was a fool thing to do, walking into town," she chided. Though her words were directed at Clara, her grateful eyes were on Elias. "From now on, you stay put at the house." That evening, Elias made a decision. The danger was escalating. He couldn't keep Clara locked in his house forever, and Croft would not be deterred by a single-armed confrontation. He would become more subtle or more violent. There was only one solution. She had to leave. He found her on the small porch behind the house, watching the last colors of the sunset fade from the sky, leaving it a bruised purple. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of sage. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "There's a stagecoach that passes through to Cheyenne tomorrow at dawn," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It's not the train, but it will get you there. From Cheyenne, you can get a train anywhere. I have some money saved. Enough for your ticket and to see you settled somewhere safe." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. "You want me to run? I want you to be safe," he corrected her. "You can't stay here, Clara. Croft won't stop. As long as you are here, and you have that deed, your life is in danger. My life is in danger. You bring trouble." The last words were harsher than he intended, a desperate attempt to fortify the walls she had so effortlessly breached. He was pushing her away to protect her, but also to protect himself. He was getting too used to her presence, to the sound of her voice in his quiet house, to the way the lamplight caught the gold in her hair. He was starting to feel again, and it terrified him. A hurt look flashed in her eyes, sharp and quick. "I see," she said, her voice turning brittle. "I'm a trouble to be disposed of, a package to be sent east. I thought after last night, I thought you understood." "Understanding doesn't change the facts," he said, his own voice tight. "This is not your world. You don't belong here." She stepped closer to him, her anger a palpable heat. "And you get to decide that? You, who hides from the world in this dusty, forgotten town. You think you're the only one who has ever lost anything? The only one who knows how to survive." Her voice trembled with passion. "I'm not that fragile creature who stepped off the train. I will not be scared away. This isn't about being scared." He shot back, his frustration mounting. "It's about being smart. Staying here is a death sentence, or maybe," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "it's a chance to fight for something. This land is all I have left of my father. It's mine. Why should I let some bully frighten me away from the only thing I have to my name?" They stood facing each other under the first pale stars, the air crackling with unspoken emotions. He was trying to save her, and she was refusing to be saved, and in her refusal, she was challenging the very foundation of his solitary existence. She was challenging him to do more than just survive, to do more than just uphold the law. She was challenging him to fight alongside her. He looked into her determined, fiery eyes, and he felt his resolve waver. He wanted her gone. He needed her gone for his own peace of mind. But a deeper, more treacherous part of him wanted her to stay. He was caught in a trap of his own making, torn between his duty to protect her and a growing, terrifying desire to simply have her near. "The stage leaves at dawn," he repeated, his voice strained. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving her alone in the darkness. He needed to believe she would be on it. He needed to believe he was strong enough to let her go. But as he lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he could not escape the haunting feeling that sending her away would be a far greater loss than any danger she might bring by staying. The pre-dawn light was the color of ash, thin and cold, as Elias stood by the window, a mug of coffee untouched in his hand. The stagecoach was already there, a lumbering shadow in the center of the street. The driver was making his final preparations, the creak of the leather harnesses and the soft snorting of the horses the only sounds in the sleeping town. Elias had packed a small bag for her with food and a canteen of water. He had placed the money for her ticket in an envelope on the kitchen table. He had done everything he was supposed to do. He had provided the means of escape. He had not seen her yet. Her room was at the back of the house, its door closed. He told himself it was better this way. A clean break. No emotion with vice. He would hear the front door open and close, and he would watch from a window as she walked to the coach, a small figure receding from his life, taking the unwelcome warmth and color with her. Then the town would be quiet again. His life would be quiet again. The thought should have brought him comfort. It only brought a profound and aching emptiness. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. He turned. Clara was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, fully dressed, but not for travel. She wore the same determined expression as the night before. Her valise was nowhere in sight. "I'm not going," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The words landed like stones in the silent room. He had expected it, dreaded it, and yet a foolish, traitorous part of him soared with relief. He quickly crushed the feeling. "Don't be a fool, Clara." He used her first name without thinking. "This isn't a game, I know that," she said, walking further into the room. She picked up the envelope of money from the table. "This is your money, Sheriff. I will not take it, and I will not run. If I run from this, I will be running for the rest of my life. My father, he was a good man, but he was not a brave one. He always chose the safer path. I will not be like him." She placed the envelope back on the table with an air of finality. Outside, the stagecoach driver shouted a final call. The sound was a punctuation mark on her decision. Elias walked to the front door and looked out. He saw the driver climb onto his seat, take up the reins, and with a crack of his whip, the heavy coach lurched into motion. It rumbled down the street, gathering speed, and disappeared into the gray dawn, leaving only a cloud of dust behind. It was done. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to face the storm with him. He turned back to her, a storm of emotions warring within him. Anger at her stubbornness, fear for her safety, and a deep, unsettling admiration for her courage. "Then you'll do exactly as I say," he said, his voice hard. "You will not leave this house without me. You will not speak to anyone. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," she replied, her chin held high. "But I will not be a prisoner, Sheriff. I will help. Martha is teaching me to shoot." Elias stared at her. "She's what?" "A woman on the frontier should know how to handle a firearm," Clara said, as if reciting a lesson. "It is a matter of practical self-preservation." "Martha agrees." Elias ran a hand through his hair in exasperation. His carefully ordered world was not just being disrupted, it was being completely overturned. He had a refined lady from Boston learning to shoot a rifle in his backyard, a cattle baron trying to kill her, and a heart that was beating with a life he had long thought extinguished. For the next 2 days, An uneasy quiet descended. It was the calm before the storm. Elias rode out, patrolling the town's perimeter, his senses on high alert. He saw Croft's men watching from the distant ridges, vultures waiting for an opportunity. He knew Croft was planning something. The direct approach had failed. The next one would be more cunning and more deadly. Inside the house, a strange domesticity took root. Clara helped Martha with the chores, her initial clumsiness giving way to a surprising competence. She was a quick learner, and her determination was formidable. Elias would return in the evenings, tired and grim, to find the house filled with the smell of baking bread and the quiet sounds of two women working together. He would sit at the table with them, a silent observer, feeling the ice around his heart continue to melt, flake by flake. He watched her in the evenings as she read by the firelight, her brow furrowed in concentration. He listened to her intelligent questions about the territory, about its history, its dangers, and its stark beauty. He found himself talking more than he had in years, describing the changing of the seasons, the habits of the wildlife, the way the stars looked in the vast, dark sky, undimmed by city lights. He was showing her his world, and in doing so, seeing it anew through her eyes. He was beginning to realize that he wasn't just protecting her. He was connecting with her. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. On the third night, the storm broke. Elias was in his office, cleaning his rifle, when he heard the faint sound of a twig snapping outside. It was a sound that did not belong in the night's usual chorus of wind and insects. He froze, every nerve ending tingling with alarm. He rose silently and moved to the window, peering into the inky blackness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement near the corner of the house, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He moved swiftly and silently back into the main house. Claire and Martha were in the kitchen, cleaning up after supper. "Get down," he whispered, his voice urgent. "And stay quiet." Fear flashed in their eyes, but they did as he commanded without question, dropping to the floor behind the heavy oak table. Elias blew out the main lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the embers in the hearth. He moved to the front window, his rifle in his hands, its wooden stock smooth and familiar against his cheek. Another shadow moved on the other side of the street. Then another. They were surrounding the house. Croft had sent at least 4 men, maybe more. They were not planning on a subtle attack. They were planning on an overwhelming one. They meant to end this tonight. A voice called out from the darkness, rough and confident. It was Jed. "Thorne, we know she's in there. Send out the girl and the deed, and Croft will let you live." Elias didn't answer. He remained a motionless silhouette by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness, cataloging the positions of the attackers. He was outnumbered, but this was his ground. He knew every creak of the floorboards, every angle of the walls. "Don't be a fool, Thorne," Jed shouted again. "There's 4 of us. You can't win." A gunshot shattered the night, and a slug slammed into the wooden frame of the window, inches from Elias's head, spraying him with splinters. The siege had begun. He returned fire, a single, deliberate shot aimed at the muzzle flash. A cry of pain from the darkness told him he had found his mark. The night exploded into a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the house, shattering a glass pitcher on the sideboard, thudding into the log walls with sickening finality. Elias moved from window to window, firing sparingly, making every shot count. He was a calm, efficient instrument of violence, his years as a soldier and a lawman taking over. He heard a movement from the kitchen and turned to see Clara crawling toward him, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. She was dragging a second rifle, one of Martha's old Winchesters. "Martha is by the back door," she whispered, her voice tight with adrenaline. "She said to tell you she's watching the alley." He looked at her, at the rifle in her hands, and a part of him wanted to scream at her to hide, to stay safe. But he saw the look in her eyes. She was not going to hide. She was a soldier in this fight, too. "Can you use that?" he asked, his voice low. "Martha showed me," she said. "Point and shoot. And don't stop to think, all right," he said, a grim pride swelling in his chest. "Take the side window." Don't show yourself. Just watch the stable. If anything moves, you shoot. She crawled to the position, her movements surprisingly agile. He watched her for a second. This woman from Boston, this governess preparing to defend his home, to defend their lives. His heart ached with a terrible, fierce love for her. He had been so wrong. She did belong here. She belonged here with him. The fighting raged on. A bullet grazed Elias's arm, a searing line of fire. He ignored the pain. He heard the boom of Martha's rifle from the back of the house, followed by a satisfying thud. That was 2 down, but 2 more were still out there, circling, looking for a weakness. Suddenly, there was a crash of breaking glass from his office. One of them had gotten to the side of the house, an angle he couldn't cover. "He's in the office!" Elias yelled. He turned to move toward the office door, but at that moment, the front door of the house burst open, splintering from a heavy kick. He swung his rifle around and fired from the hip. The bullet caught Jed square in the chest, throwing him backward out of the doorway and onto the porch where he lay still. But the threat was not over. The man in the office. Elias spun toward the office door just as the last of Croft's men burst through it. A large, bearded man with a hunting knife in his hand. He lunged at Elias, too close for the rifle to be effective. Elias used the weapon as a club, swinging the heavy stock, but the man was big and strong. He absorbed the blow and crashed into Elias, sending them both to the floor. The rifle skittered away into the darkness. They wrestled on the floor, a grunting, desperate struggle. The man was heavier, stronger. He raised the knife, its blade glinting in the faint firelight. Elias caught his wrist, his muscles straining, holding the point of the blade inches from his own throat. He could feel his strength failing. The man's face was a mask of brutal effort, his breath hot and foul. Suddenly, the man grunted, his eyes going wide with shock. His body went limp. He slumped sideways, revealing Clara standing behind him, her face a mask of terror and resolve. In her hands, she held the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its end now dark with blood. She had swung it with all her might against the back of the man's head. She dropped the poker with a clatter and stared down at the unmoving form, her hands trembling violently. Elias scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled her away from the body, into his arms. She collapsed against him, shaking uncontrollably, the aftermath of the violence hitting her with full force. He held her tight, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and gunpowder. "It's over," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "It's over. You're safe." He held her for a long time in the shattered, silent room, surrounded by the evidence of the battle. The danger had passed, but something profound had shifted between them in the crucible of the fight. He had seen her courage, her strength, and he had faced the terrifying, absolute certainty that he could not live without her. The walls of his fortress had not just been breached, they had been utterly demolished. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of his feelings for her. He gently pushed her back, his hands on her shoulders, and looked down at her face, illuminated by the dying fire. Her eyes were wide, her face smudged with soot. He saw the tremor in her lips. He had to tell her. He had to say the words before the moment was lost, before his old fears could rebuild the walls. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "When I saw Jed in that doorway, when I thought he was going to, all I could think about was you. I was a fool, a blind, stubborn fool. I built a life of solitude because I thought it would keep me safe from feeling anything again. I thought it was strength, but it was just a prison. You walked into my life and showed me what real strength is. It's not hiding from the world. It's facing it. It's fighting for what you love." He took a shaky breath. The words were coming now, a flood tide of emotion held back for 5 long years. "I love you, Clara Pemberton. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you see beauty in this harsh land. I don't want to be alone anymore. I want to build a life with you." Here, tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. They were not tears of fear or sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought you were only protecting me out of a sense of duty." "It started as duty," he admitted, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "But it became something else so quickly I didn't even see it happening. It became everything." She threw her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his shoulder. "I love you too," she sobbed. "From the moment you caught me on that platform. Even when you were so stern and remote, I saw the good man underneath. The lonely man. I didn't want to leave. I couldn't." He held her, feeling the last of the ice in his veins melt away, replaced by a warmth that spread through his entire being. In the wreckage of his home, surrounded by the violence they had survived, he had finally found what he had run from for so long. A reason to live, not just to exist. He had found a new home, not in a place, but in a person. The sound of approaching footsteps and voices outside broke the spell. The townspeople, roused by the gunfire, were coming with lanterns and rifles. Elias gently set Clara apart from him, though he kept one of her hands firmly in his. "It's all right," he said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "The law is coming." He led her to the broken doorway and stepped out onto the porch to meet them, no longer a solitary figure of the law, but a man with a future standing beside him, their hands linked together against the darkness. In the days that followed, redemption buzzed with the story of the shootout at the sheriff's house. Doc Evans patched up the gash on Elias's arm, clucking his tongue, but with a new respect in his eyes. The bodies of Croft's men were buried in a nameless plot on Boot Hill. Elias, accompanied by a half-dozen deputized townsmen, rode out to Silas Croft's ranch. They found him packing, a desperate animal caught in a trap. Faced with the undeniable evidence of his hired guns and a warrant for conspiracy to commit murder, Croft's bluster collapsed. He was brought back in chains, his reign of terror over. The town, which had once watched Clara with suspicious eyes, now saw her as a hero. She was no longer the out-of-place Easterner, but the woman who had stood with their sheriff, who had fought for her home. They greeted her with smiles and nods of respect. Mr. Henderson offered her the job in his store, but she politely declined. Her future, she knew, was not in ledgers and accounts. One evening, a week after the attack, Elias and Clara sat on the porch. The broken door had been replaced, the bullet holes in the walls patched. A quiet peace had settled back over the house, but it was a different kind of peace now. It was not the empty silence of solitude, but the warm, comfortable silence of companionship. Elias turned to her, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. He held a small, velvet-worn box in his hand. He opened it. Inside was a simple gold ring, delicate and slightly old-fashioned. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice quiet and steady. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me from Mary. It's a ring for a woman who knows how to build a life, how to make a home in a hard place. It belongs with you, Clara. If you'll have it." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me on your land?" Our land. Tears once again filled her eyes, but this time they were of pure, unadulterated happiness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Oh yes, Elias. Of course. I will." He slipped a ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. She held up her hand, watching the gold catch the last rays of the sun. It was a symbol not just of his love, but of a future she had never dared to dream of. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers, and they sat together, watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky, two solitary souls who had found their other half at the edge of the world. The town celebrated their wedding with a potluck supper and a barn dance. Martha wept openly, dabbing her eyes with her apron. Ben, the station master, proposed a heartfelt, rambling toast. Even the most grizzled cowboys offered their sincere congratulations. Elias, who had always stood at the edge of any social gathering, now stood in the center of it, his arm around his wife, a small, genuine smile on his face. He was no longer just the sheriff. He was a part of the community, a part of its future. Clara, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her sew, moved with a newfound confidence and grace. She was home. 2 years later, the house that stood on Clara's land was no longer the small, rough cabin they had started with. It was a proper ranch house now, with a wide porch and glass windows that looked out over the rolling hills and the life-giving waters of Willow Creek. The land, which her father had called a folly, was thriving. A herd of healthy cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and a field of alfalfa swayed in the gentle afternoon breeze. The ranch was a testament to their hard work, their partnership, and their shared dream. Clara stood on the porch, a soft breeze playing with a loose strand of her honey-blonde hair. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off the train in a fine green dress. Her hands were capable and strong, her skin tanned by the sun. She wore a simple calico dress, and her expression was one of deep, serene contentment. A small, dark-haired boy of about a year old played at her feet, happily banging a wooden spoon against the porch steps. He had his father's serious gray eyes. A rider appeared on the horizon, and she smiled. It was Elias, returning from his daily ride of the property line. He no longer wore the sheriff's star. He had resigned a year ago, recommending a capable young deputy to take his place. His life was here now, on this land with his family. As he drew closer, she could see the easy way he sat in the saddle, a man completely at peace with his world. He dismounted and came up the steps, his boots making a familiar, welcome sound. He swept the little boy up into his arms, planting a kiss on his chubby cheek, eliciting a delighted squeal. Then he turned to Clara, his eyes full of a deep and abiding love that still made her heart skip a beat. "Everything quiet?" she asked, her hand resting on his arm. "Quiet as a prayer," he answered, his gaze sweeping over the peaceful vista of their home. He looked back at her, his smile gentle. He placed a hand on her stomach, where their second child was beginning to show. "And how are you two?" "We're perfect," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. They stood there together, a family framed against the vast, beautiful landscape. The sun was warm on their faces, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and clean earth. The silence that surrounded them was no longer empty or lonely. It was full. It was full of life, of love, and of the promise of all the years to come. "I never thought I could be this happy," Elias said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "I never thought I deserved to be." Clara looked up at him, her sky-blue eyes full of love. "We built this, Elias," she said softly. "You and me. We earned this." He looked down at her, at his son in his arms, at the home they had made from nothing but a worthless piece of paper and a shared, stubborn hope. She was right. This was not something he had been given. It was something they had fought for together. He bent his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss full of gratitude and love, a promise of a future as wide and as bright as the Wyoming sky.